Hello everyone, and welcome to Fresh Master Channel. Today, we are going to have some story from Reddit. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe, like the video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment down below. These simple clips mean a lot to the future of this channel.
Jessica's childhood was marked by long summers spent on her grandparents' farm in upstate New York. While her brothers found the rural setting dull, Jessica loved every moment of it. She developed a deep appreciation for hard work as she helped her grandfather tend to the animals and plant crops. It was here, during those quiet evenings under the stars, that she began dreaming of a life full of adventure and purpose. Joseph, on the other hand, grew up in a bustling port city where his father worked as a dock supervisor. Fascinated by the constant movement of ships and goods, he spent countless hours sketching vessels and imagining their distant destinations. One day, while exploring the docks, he found an abandoned model ship that he painstakingly restored. This sparked a lifelong interest in craftsmanship and problem-solving, traits that would later define his career. In high school, Jessica joined a debate club to challenge herself academically. Her sharp wit and ability to think on her feet made her an instant standout. During a state competition, she impressed a visiting college professor who encouraged her to consider a future in leadership roles. This advice stayed with her, motivating her to take on captaincy positions in various extracurricular activities, including sports teams. Joseph's teenage years were marked by a personal tragedy when his best friend Colin moved away unexpectedly. Determined to stay connected, Joseph built a simple messaging system using an old computer his uncle had gifted him. This not only kept their friendship alive, but also sparked his interest in technology. By the time he graduated, Joseph was already skilled in coding and had earned a small scholarship to study computer science at a nearby university. During college, Jessica interned at an international nonprofit organization where she coordinated outreach programs for underprivileged children. One memorable summer, she organized a beach cleanup that brought together volunteers from all walks of life. The experience taught her the importance of community and the power of collective action, values she would carry into her adult life. Before Joseph and Jessica's paths crossed, a significant moment occurred when Joseph led a team of volunteers to restore a historic lighthouse near his hometown. The project was grueling, requiring both technical knowledge and sheer determination, but the end result was a fully operational beacon that became a symbol of hope for the local community. This accomplishment earned him recognition and further solidified his reputation as a problem solver and leader. Joseph and Jessica first crossed paths at a church event in their East Coast hometown. They quickly realized they shared many interests: beaches, movies, professional sports, running, volleyball, and parties. It seemed like everyone around them thought they were a perfect match. Their relationship blossomed during a volleyball tournament. Originally, Joe's friend Liam was supposed to partner with Jess for the mixed doubles, but something came up and he couldn't make it. Liam called both Joe and Jess, explaining the situation and suggesting that they team up instead. They agreed without hesitation. They managed to squeeze in a couple of short practices before the tournament. Jess played with a fearless intensity, diving for the ball and setting it perfectly, while Joe's tall, powerful frame delivered some impressive hits. Their chemistry on the court was undeniable. The duo went on to win the tournament, celebrating afterward with the other teams at a bar. Jess was very touchy, often finding excuses to make physical contact, and Joe found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't anticipated. Her beauty captivated him, and the constant physical closeness only added to the excitement. When they got back to her apartment that evening, Jess kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto the sofa, with Joe following suit. "That was such an amazing day," Jess sighed, looking content. "Yeah, it really means a lot to me too," Joe replied. "When Liam called to tell me he couldn't play, I thought we were out of luck, and when I first saw you, I thought you were cute, but I figured we'd be out pretty early." "Well, we probably would have been," Jess agreed with a smile. "You really are a volleyball pro," Joe said with a grin. "Do you actually think that?" Jess asked, looking at him curiously. "Something like that," Joe answered, still amazed by the day's events. "The energy from the win, the party. It just feels so intense right now. I'm really enjoying this," Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. Jess, looking at him with a smile, leaned in and quickly kissed his forehead. "I never would have imagined that today would go like this. It's not every day a friend asks you to play your favorite sport with someone who is not only attractive, but also skilled enough to win the tournament." "Yeah, it really was a great day," Jess murmured, her voice soft. "Ooh, do you still feel dizzy and dry-mouthed?" she teased, her eyes sparkling. Definitely, Joe admitted. She leaned closer, her face almost touching his, and ran her hand up his thigh, teasing the edge of his shorts. How does that feel? Does it help? It definitely makes me feel dizzy and dry, Joe confessed. Jess then slid her hand higher, reaching the waistband of his shorts. He could barely breathe. It adds a whole new level. Something I can't quite put into words, Joe managed to say, his voice trembling. She brought her face closer to his, her eyes locking with his as she whispered, "This makes me feel something." "What do you mean?" Joe asked. His curiosity piqued. "It makes me nervous, Jess," Joe admitted. "My heart's racing, and I'm focused more on how you turn me on than on your volleyball skills." "Oh, I have other skills too, not just on the court," Jess teased, her voice light. Joe couldn't help but smile. "I'm not really thinking about skills right now." Leaning in, he kissed her, savoring the softness of her lips. They lingered for a moment before Joe pulled back, gazing at her face. "What are you looking at?" she asked, her lips slightly parted in a smile, her eyes full of mischief. "I can't help but notice how perfect your lips are," Joe said. "How your lashes make your eyes look even more stunning. Your nose is so cute. And those 3 freckles right under your right eye? Adorable. You're perfect, Jessica." Jess's voice softened. "That's a little overwhelming." For the next couple of minutes, they sat in silence. A single tear slid down Jess's cheek, glistening as it traced a path down her face. She closed the gap between them, her lips meeting his once again. Her hand moved to the front of his shorts, testing his earlier claim. "I really want to know what else I can make you feel," she whispered. "Come with me." With that, Jess stood and gently guided him to her bedroom. As soon as they entered, she swiftly removed his shorts and yanked his shirt over his head. Then, with a commanding gesture, she took his hands and placed them at his sides before stepping back and locking eyes with him. She slowly pulled her sleeveless t-shirt over her head and tossed it aside. She noticed Joe's gaze shift from her face to the lace sports bra she wore. With a subtle smile, she continued to undress, lowering her shorts to reveal her toned legs and sun-kissed skin. She casually discarded them, then did the same with her underwear, leaving Joe captivated by the view. Jess's eyes sparkled with a confident smile as she slowly pulled her bra off, her movements deliberate and teasing. She tossed the lace fabric aside, stepping closer to him. When she was within arm's reach, she grabbed him, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through him. She stroked him gently and then, without breaking eye contact, guided him towards the bed. "I really want you to make me feel something now," she whispered as she leaned back, pulling his head toward her. Within minutes, Joe proved he was just as skilled in this area as he was on the volleyball court. Just before Jess reached her first peak of the evening, a thought crossed her mind. He's perfect. Their relationship continued to evolve over the next year. They picked a beautiful Caribbean island for their wedding and, after about 2 years of marriage, made a vow to be each other's one true love, committing to abandon all others. And they did, tying the knot in a ceremony that felt like the beginning of something permanent. Their love life was vibrant, and although Joe sometimes struggled to keep up with Jess's energy, they both enjoyed their closeness immensely. They bought an old house in a prime location, and within a few weeks, they had christened every room, plus the backyard on a moonless night. They were both strikingly attractive. Joe had once been offered a modeling contract, and Jess had the face of a professional model. With a trim, athletic build, Jess had a C-cup and just the right amount of body fat to stay healthy on her 58-inch frame. They both kept in excellent physical shape and enjoyed working out. Their careers were flourishing, too. Jess worked in the technical equipment department, while Joe was in software development. They made good money, had fun together, and balanced their work-life dynamics well. Joe enjoyed mountain biking and photography, while Jess was passionate about cooking, pop culture, and maintaining her fitness. She loved showing off her cooking skills, especially through fun pop culture quizzes. Their friends and family saw them as the perfect couple. They shared nearly every interest, and even when they disagreed on something, they always handled it calmly and respectfully. Whether it was politics or personal matters, they would talk things through, sometimes in front of others, and reach a resolution. On the rare occasion when things got heated, they would step away for private discussions, always making up by the end. Their friends would just smile knowingly and say, "They really are perfect for each other." Both were highly respected at work, contributing significantly to their teams. There were no hierarchies. They were peers. Joe's expertise in software development even helped Jess solve a problem at her job, when the company's new software wasn't functioning as it should. She'd been struggling with it, and one evening, Joe overheard her frustration from the office. When she explained the issue, Joe quickly identified what needed to be fixed. He wrote a small program called Routine that made the software work much more smoothly. Jess was grateful, not only with words, but with physical affection. Though she didn't inform her company about Joe's fix, it made her work far easier and faster, and the whole team benefited. When Jess's company later gave her credit for improving the software, Joe shared his contribution with his team, explaining how Routine helped improve their own software development. They found it useful in their projects, and his solution became a valuable tool. Both were focused on building a solid financial future. With smart investments and a few major sales, Jess sometimes earned six-figure bonuses. They used the extra money to buy, renovate, and rent out homes, steadily growing their real estate portfolio. After 7 years of marriage, they owned 3 houses and a condominium, with Joe managing renovations and handling maintenance tasks like security systems, sprinklers, and Wi-Fi issues. Jess usually worked more at her company when Joe took on these home improvement projects. One Saturday, shortly after their 9th anniversary, Joe planned to fix the irrigation system at one of their rental properties. Jess, feeling a bit neglected, decided to take matters into her own hands. "Joe, before you get into those pipes, I need your help with something," she called from the house. "Is there a leak?" Joe shouted, walking toward the garage. "Well, there aren't exactly pipes running through the ceiling of our bedroom," she teased. "Better go check it out," he replied, setting down his tools and heading inside. When he walked into their bedroom, he froze, his jaw dropping. Jess lay on the bed, wearing nothing but the Bud clamps on her chest, each with a small, battery-powered vibrator attached. The quiet hum of the devices filled the room. Her knees were bent and spread apart. "What the—" Joe stammered, still processing the sight. "Baby," she breathed, "I think you need to stay here with me right now." Her lips parted, and she looked at him with a mixture of need and anticipation. He had been holding his breath, and as soon as he realized it, he dropped his keys, hurriedly shedding his clothes. Fixing pipes was normally a precise, thought-intensive task, but today, Joe was focused on something far more immediate. He didn't leave the bedroom, but he was busy, measuring with his eyes, thinking with his senses, and working hard with his lips and tongue. The job moved smoothly, and by the end of it, both of them had experienced multiple climaxes. They had talked about starting a family once they were financially secure, and with several properties and 6 figures in their savings, Joe was eager to take the next step. Jess, however, wanted to focus on a few career goals first. She had recently been promoted and felt like her career was more than just a job. It was a passion. Their lives continued to unfold, with their deep connection strengthening every year. The future was bright, full of promise and new opportunities, and together they built a life that reflected both their love for each other and their shared ambitions. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Joe and Jess celebrated by winning a cornhole game at a party hosted by their friends and family. The theme of the event was "Perfect for Each Other." Afterward, the entire group piled into 2 rented limousines for a 4-day vineyard tour. When they returned home, Joe and Jess wasted no time shedding their clothes as soon as they walked through the door. Their anniversary celebration carried on through the living room, up the stairs, and into the bedroom. Life was great. They truly seemed made for each other. Soon after, Jess received some exciting news at work. She had been promoted to Director of Divisional Services. Thrilled, she shared the news with Joe when she got home, and the two of them celebrated at dinner at La Pommade, continuing their festivities when they returned home, where they celebrated multiple times throughout the evening. At work, Jess encountered Curtis Stanley, a new colleague who had a striking resemblance to Joe, tall, handsome, in great shape. Curtis had recently been hired as the Director of New Accounts and often traveled from New York to the Department of the Interior. His good looks, impeccable fashion, and charming, flirtatious personality made him very popular with the women in the office. While company policy prohibited romantic relationships between managers and subordinates, there were no restrictions on relationships between peers at the same level. The company's CEO, Miriam, a divorced mother of 2, enjoyed the company of young, attractive men, and Curtis quickly took note of Jess. He was intrigued by her. Not only was she beautiful, but it was clear she had a strong professional reputation. After learning about her happy marriage to Joe, Curtis decided that even a perfect marriage might need some extra excitement. He began to subtly pursue Jess, starting with casual lunches to discuss business. As they worked together, Curtis did his homework, learning more about Jess's career, her interests, and her personal life. He often praised her accomplishments, emphasizing how her recent promotion had made her more valuable to the company and to herself. Curtis frequently arranged business trips to New York, specifically asking Jess to join him to explain how her division could support new clients. During these trips, he made sure to highlight her contributions, ensuring her efforts were recognized by her superiors. His compliments made Jess feel appreciated and affirmed, and the dynamic began to feel like more than just work. Curtis arranged for them to visit the best spots in New York, and she looked forward to these trips, where the time spent with him felt increasingly important. Meanwhile, Jo and Jess's relationship started to change. With the added pressure from her career and her growing connection with Curtis, their intimate moments became fewer. Jo, sensing the distance between them, tried talking to her about their relationship, but their conversations usually ended with her venting about work stress. To make up for it, Jess planned a surprise for their anniversary, an Italian getaway. Jo had always dreamed of visiting Italy, so she booked the trip for September, and they spent the spring planning their time together in Italy. A few weeks later, Jess's company scheduled an executive retreat in Miami for July. She had to attend, and after much consideration, she decided to tell Jo about the change in their plans over dinner. "Jo, honey, I've got some good news and some bad news," Jess began. Jo looked up, intrigued. "What do you want to hear first?" "Let me just get it all out," Jess said, taking a deep breath. "I've decided to cancel our trip to Italy in September. Instead, I'll be heading to Miami for the retreat in July." Jo blinked, taken aback. "Wait, didn't the Miami retreat already fit into your schedule?" "Yeah, it did," Jess nodded. "But it actually works out better for us now. The company is covering the hotel, so we'll save some money. Plus, Miami is an awesome place. Great beaches, amazing restaurants. We could even play volleyball on the beach." Jo paused, absorbing the change, his surprise giving way to curiosity. "But if you're working, how will we spend time together?" Jo asked, a little skeptical. "Well, the workday usually finishes by lunchtime, so we'll have the afternoons and the weekend to ourselves," she assured him. Jo hesitated. "We've got enough saved up to go to Miami, but I don't see why we need to cancel Italy. I've barely settled into the new place, and I don't want to skip a trip I've been looking forward to for so long." Jess's response was firm. "I've already canceled the Italy trip. We can plan it for the future. For now, we'll make the most of Miami." The discussion didn't lead anywhere, and Jo, feeling somewhat disappointed, decided to go ahead and make the most of their upcoming trip. He made reservations at a nice restaurant in Miami and started researching local volleyball tournaments, hoping to make the best of their time there. Before they left for Miami, Jess took another business trip to New York. She never provided specific details about what she did after work hours, often telling Jo that she was either having dinner meetings or dealing with a major issue with a West Coast client. Jo didn't press her for more information, though he started to notice that the distance between them seemed to be widening. The romantic spark that had once defined their relationship was fading as Jess became more absorbed in her work and the attention she received from Curtis. Miami was a perfect place to unwind. Sunny beaches, good vibes, and excellent restaurants. Jo and Jess arrived on Sunday afternoon and immediately checked into their hotel to enjoy some downtime by the beach. They even managed to play an hour of volleyball, squeezing in a few games. That evening was a welcome dinner for the company retreat, and Jess asked if Jo could attend. Miriam, the CEO, gave her blessing. At the dinner, Jess spent some time chatting with Curtis, which made Jo uncomfortable. When he suggested she either stay close to him or leave, she assured him it was just a business conversation. After all, they were there for a professional retreat. Miriam, who had always found Jo attractive, noticed him standing off to the side and decided to strike up a conversation. She knew Jo wasn't in the executive circle, but she had been introduced to him earlier and knew he was a competent professional in another field. After a few drinks, Miriam's flirtation became apparent. She ran her finger along Jo's arm and even grabbed his wrist in a suggestive manner. Jo, trying to remain polite, gently but firmly made it clear that he wasn't interested, excusing himself to the restroom to get away. Miriam, feeling awkward and rejected, wasn't pleased with the situation. When the event ended, Jo convinced Jess to join him at the bar for a few drinks. However, Curtis showed up shortly after, and their time alone together was cut short. Eventually, they both agreed to call it a night. But once back in their hotel room, Jess was too tired for any closeness. As Jo had feared, Jess's work commitments extended well beyond 5 p.m., and the next few nights were filled with executive-only events. Joe spent many of his evenings sitting alone in the hotel hallway, waiting for her to finish her work or come out for lunch. While Joe did get some time to play volleyball, the beach was filled with attractive women. Yet, despite the attention he received, it wasn't the kind he was seeking. Miriam, still nursing her irritation from being rebuffed by Joe, noticed Curtis making harsh comments about those lower on the corporate ladder. She eagerly joined in, adding fuel to the fire. Miriam later used Joe as an example during a discussion about the hierarchy in the company, pointing out the difference between worker bees and the executives during a hiring meeting. All in all, Miami didn't end up being the grand anniversary celebration Joe had hoped for. They managed to have closeness maybe 4 times during the weekend after work events, leaving Joe disappointed. Jess, on the other hand, returned home feeling energized by her growing position in the company. Back in their routine, life resumed as it had been before the trip. Joe kept working, while Jess was increasingly busy in New York. Whenever Joe asked about her time there, he got the same generic responses. Mid-September arrived, and Joe decided to bring up his concerns. "Hey babe, I never realized your company was so focused on New York. What's changed?" Joe asked. "You're right, it wasn't always like this," Jess replied. "But we're expanding rapidly, and it makes sense to concentrate a lot of customers in one place so we can handle several problems in one trip." "So why are you so wrapped up in sales?" Joe pressed. Miriam says having a post-sales service person involved during the sales process boosts closing rates. It's working well, actually. This is all part of a long-term plan, and once it's finished, things should slow down. After this, the focus will shift more toward services, and I'll have fewer sales meetings. I've got some meetings in New York this week, and then I'm off to the Midwest in October. Joe was hopeful that after this busy period, Jess's work schedule would ease up, and they could reconnect. But as time went on, their relationship began to feel more like that of roommates. Physical closeness dwindled to about 4 times a month. Jess came home on Friday from New York, and Joe greeted her with her favorite dinner, grilled steak and wine. She kissed him briefly, then poured herself a second glass of wine. "Thanks for making dinner, baby," she said with a smile. "It's like a holiday," Joe replied. "I'm just happy to have you home for the next week. I hope we can relax a bit." "The relaxation will be short, honey," she answered. "I have to head back to New York on Saturday evening." Joe, clearly disappointed, asked, "I thought you'd be home all week. What's the plan for the weekend?" "I'm sorry, Joe," she said, her voice firm. "This is just how things have to fall into place." Joe silently began cleaning up after dinner, moving around the kitchen while Jess sipped her wine. The tension was thick in the air, and neither of them said much. Feeling the frustration building, Joe moved to the laundry room to start a load of clothes. "Do you have anything I should wash before you leave, Jess?" he asked. "No, that's fine. I'm all good," she replied. "All good," he repeated, a bit confused. "It's fine. It's just expensive to do laundry at hotels," she said casually. "Did your company pay for it?" he asked, sensing something was off. "No," she replied quickly. "I did it at Curtis's apartment." "What?" Joe's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Why did you stay with him?" "No, it wasn't to save money," Jess said, her tone defensive. "Look, Joe, I've been thinking a lot about my life lately. I'm getting closer to 40, and I want to make sure I don't miss out on certain things. If my life stays as it is, those things won't happen. My last 2 trips to New York have really brought this to the forefront." After a pause, she continued, "Now that I'm a director, I work closely with other top executives. Curtis is one of them. After work, we go to the theater or the museum. We dine at places like the Rainbow Room or Luger. He treats me like royalty. I want more of that. Those are the kinds of things I want my life to be about." Joe stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what Jess had just said. "Jess, we've had a good run," he began, his voice cracking. "But I can't believe you're saying this. We talked about our future. We talked about kids. Why are you saying you don't see me in your future anymore?" Jess's response was sharp, devoid of any warmth. "Joe, you're a good guy, but you're just not the guy I need. You're fine as a service worker, someone who installs locks and sprinklers, but you'll never be a leader. You're never going to be someone people follow. You're not the person I want in my life long term. You're not the man I deserve." Joe felt the air go cold as his heart dropped. "Wait, did you sleep with that guy in New York?" he asked, barely able to keep his voice from shaking. Jess's eyes narrowed as she responded coldly. "That's not something you get to ask." "Why not? I'm your husband," he snapped. The person you promised to love and spend your life with? Jess met his gaze with a sneer, her words venomous. This is my body, Joe. I can sleep with whoever I want. If I decide to sleep with the entire New York Giants, that's none of your business. Joe's world seemed to crash around him as her words hit him like a ton of bricks. I probably never really loved you the way you think I did, Jess continued, her tone now colder than ever. It was a mistake from the start. I'm filing for divorce, and that's it. Don't call me baby anymore. I'm not your wife anymore, and we won't be sleeping in the same bed. Joe was stunned, his mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. He wanted to lash out, to confront her about what had gone wrong. He thought of walking out or kicking her out. What had he done to deserve this? Why was she looking for someone else? Was he really that beneath her? Jess, you're divorcing me because you think some other guy is better than me, right? Joe's voice was tight with barely contained emotion. Oh no, Jess replied, her voice biting. Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. Then why did we talk about the future? About having kids? Joe's voice wavered as he tried to understand what was happening. It's not just about him, Jess said, dismissing him. And his name is Curtis. Joe was silent for a moment, processing the information. So, do other people think I'm beneath you too? He asked, his frustration mounting. People you respect, even? Jess rolled her eyes. Oh, really? You want names? Miriam and Gloria, for starters. They're both in the executive team. They've been talking about you. Joe stared at her in disbelief. So now the whole executive team thinks I'm just some low-class guy? Is that it? Jess didn't respond immediately, but her body language told him everything he needed to know. She was checked out, emotionally distant. What does it matter? She said dismissively. I think it's clear where we stand. Joe's eyes widened with shock. Miriam, Gloria, you're telling me they think I'm a joke? He demanded. Honestly, Joe, Jess said, this is just how it is. You're just not the guy I need in my life anymore. Joe's mind was racing. Jess, are you serious? You're going to kick me out over this? He could feel his chest tightening. Are you really going to leave me for Curtis or whatever his name is? Jess's tone remained ice cold. I don't think it's worth fighting anymore, Joe. I'm filing. And it's over. Joe, in a daze, slowly turned to go to the guest room. Fine, I'll take the guest room. As he gathered his things, his thoughts were scattered. He wasn't sure what hurt worse, the fact that Jess was leaving him, or that she was doing it for someone else. He didn't know how to process it, and his heart felt like it was being torn apart. While Jess flew to New York, Joe took the first step toward ending the marriage. He made an appointment with a family lawyer and found himself sitting across from a confident, attractive woman with sharp eyes and an authoritative presence. How can I help you, Joseph? She asked, her voice calm but professional. Please, call me Joe, he replied, trying to keep it together. I need help with a divorce. Mel nodded and leaned forward. I'll need all the details to help you best. Joe recounted everything, and she listened carefully, taking notes. She then warned him about potential emotional and legal challenges, asked about his feelings on reconciliation, and gave him a list of actions to take. As she prepared the legal documents, Joe began untangling their finances, including car ownership and other assets. Dividing the property was messy, but he and Mel worked through it, trying to come to a fair arrangement. Joe then informed their circle of friends and family about the divorce. Jess's reaction was swift and furious. You're an a-hole, she said through gritted teeth over the phone. Who gave you the right to announce our divorce? Joe replied calmly. You did, Jess. When? She demanded. When you told me you were leaving me for that guy, Curtis. I didn't want you to make a big public thing of it, Jess argued, her voice rising. I didn't give you permission to tell people like that. Joe stood firm. What's wrong with the way I worded it? I said what's true. Jess decided to neglect her vows and took a new lover from her workplace. We won't be attending family events as a couple anymore. Please respect the situation and let us end our marriage quietly. Jess's voice trembled with anger. You made me look like the bad guy, like I was some strumpet who just let herself be seduced. Joe's patience was running out. I'm not the one who slept around, Jess. You wanted this. You want it out. You think I'm some fool who stayed too long while you messed around. Well, I'm done, he added, his voice cold but clear. I've already been tested for STDs, and I suggest you do the same. If you were with him while you were still married to me, who knows who else he's been with? Jess's fury boiled over. You fool, she spat, slamming the phone down. Though Joe found some comfort in the idea of moving on, his nights were restless. He couldn't stop replaying everything that had led to this point. Even though he knew it wasn't all his fault, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he'd missed something, done something wrong. He kept remembering all the good times, the trips, the moments they shared, the intimate places where they'd connected. It all seemed so distant now, and even the taste of food began to feel flat and meaningless. The legal process moved forward without much emotion. They divided their assets, each keeping their own retirement accounts, and separated their bank accounts. The credit cards were canceled, and new ones were issued under their own names. Joe didn't want to stay in the house they had shared while they were in love, so Jess took it, along with the apartment, which was more convenient for her work and her new identity. He took what was left, an apartment not too far from the city, closer to the condominium they had once shared. 2 months passed, and aside from some formalities, they didn't speak. They occasionally bumped into each other at church or at social events. But the exchanges were minimal, curt, and awkward. The first time Jess showed up with Curtis, she insisted on introducing him to Joe. Curtis extended his hand with a grin, saying, "I've heard a lot about you, Joe." Joe looked at him but didn't offer his hand. "I wish I had known where things were heading when I first met you in Miami," he said, his voice flat. He glanced at Jess, shook his head, and turned away without another word. As the weeks went by, Joe began to notice the subtle shifts in the behavior of their mutual friends. He divided them into 2 categories, those who could be trusted and those who would inevitably share everything he said with Jess. Some of them, he realized, would no longer be part of his life, at least not in the same way. He could still hang out with them in group settings, tossing a ball around or grabbing a drink, but his deeper thoughts and feelings would stay private. He understood now why Neil Sedaka had written that breaking up was so hard. When his coworkers at the office found out about the divorce, they were overwhelmingly supportive. His boss, Evan, called him into his office, offering a kind ear. "Joe, if you need anything at all, just let me know. I can't imagine what you're going through, but I've had my own relationship troubles in the past, and sometimes it helps to talk it out. It can help you think things through." "Thanks, Evan. I appreciate it," Joe replied. "I know it's complicated, and it's hard to manage all the emotional and practical details." Evan hesitated for a moment, then added, "And look, I'm not sure if the idea of revenge has crossed your mind yet, but it probably will. Just don't do anything stupid. No violence or anything that could land you in jail. A few minutes of satisfaction won't be worth the legal trouble you'd be facing." Joe chuckled grimly. "Good advice, Evan. I'll keep that in mind." Evan raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at his lips. "Sounds like you've been down this road before, huh?" Joe smirked. "You could say that." Evan leaned back in his chair. "Well, if you want to get even, you need to be creative. Think of it like solving a problem. Lay out the options. What's acceptable, what's off limits, and then figure out where you can make an impact. Financially, socially, maybe even professionally. Use your skills, Joe. Get creative." Joe thought for a moment. "Okay, that's something to think about. If you need time off, just let me know," Evan said, his tone more serious now. Joe nodded and left the office, sitting down to clear his head. He asked Evan for permission to use the conference room, then spent the next several hours working through ideas on an old whiteboard. He broke down the possible ways he could get back at Jess into categories: social, financial, professional, self-esteem, and legal. He then invited a few close co-workers to join him and brainstorm. One of them suggested adding physical and technical retaliation to the list, which sparked more creative ideas. They made a matrix, listing each type of revenge in the first column and possible actions under each heading. No idea was too far-fetched to consider, and the room buzzed with a mix of outlandish suggestions and ones that felt more realistic. By the end of the day, Joe took a photo of the board, packed it away in a box, and put it in the back of the room. Evan called him the next day to check in. "I hope you're feeling a little better, but just a heads up, please try not to take up too much of other people's time before lunch or after hours, all right?" "Understood," Joe replied, appreciating Evan's patience. A couple of days later, while playing racquetball with a friend from church, the topic of the annual beach volleyball tournament came up. "Hey, are you going to play in the church tournament next month?" his friend asked. Joe hesitated. "I hadn't really thought about it. My volleyball partner and we're not really on speaking terms anymore." His friend nodded. "I get it, but I thought you might want to join the guys' team or something. It usually gets you in a good mood." Joe shook his head. "Probably not this year." "Okay, I saw Jess signed up," his friend added. "For mixed teams." "Did she? "When's the registration deadline?" Joe asked. "About a week before," his friend replied. Joe thanked him for the reminder. That night, he spent some time thinking, and by the next morning, he knew what he had to do. He took out the board again, updated it, and drew a new line at the bottom for sports results. At lunch, he gathered his Vengeance team and asked them to work on it during their break. That afternoon, he made a few calls and set up a meeting with an old college friend for drinks later that evening. It seemed like he was finally ready to take control, starting with a game of volleyball. The following day, Ben, a friend from Joe's VCRU group, came by his office and shut the door behind him. "Joe, how serious are you about getting back at Jess and her whole world?" he asked, his tone curious. Joe paused, considering the question. "That's a good question," he said slowly. "Why?" Ben pressed. "Because some of what we discussed in that matrix," Joe began, "could just be venting, but some of it might actually cross into illegal territory like physical violence." Ben raised an eyebrow. "But we only joked about those things," he replied. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it." Joe shook his head. "I'm not going to touch anyone. But I'll admit, if that guy Curtis disappeared, I wouldn't feel bad about it. Still, I'd never act on it. And as for Jess, I would never take her back. Trust is gone. I could never feel the same way about her again. Not after everything she's done." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "Okay, good to know. But there are other risks here. If you ever thought about reconciling with Jessica, you'd want to steer clear of anything that could escalate things. That kind of stuff can get out of hand quickly." Joe snorted. "Never again. Not in a million years. I gave her everything I had. My trust, my love, and she threw it all away for some guy. I want her to feel the weight of that decision. Spitting on someone's love and loyalty has consequences. She'll never get that back." "All right, Joe," Ben said, leaning back in his chair. "I hear you, but you might want to get legal advice on this. There could be unintended consequences if you don't keep a level head. I'll call you later." Joe continued his routine as best he could. Some days felt better than others. He focused on work and committed to playing in the upcoming volleyball tournament. He found a new partner and decided to enter, hoping it would give him a distraction. At work, he erased the idea of physical revenge from the matrix and redirected his energy to new projects. Ben didn't reach out again, so Joe figured it was just a reminder to avoid acting impulsively. Evan, his boss, never mentioned the situation again. Meanwhile, the volleyball tournament was shaping up to be a major event. Teams came from nearby states, and the competition was fierce. It had grown far beyond its humble roots as a casual church event. This year, the tournament spanned the entire weekend, kicking off on Friday and wrapping up with a massive barbecue on Sunday night after the award ceremony. Jess and Curtis made it to the finals in the mixed doubles bracket, where they would face Joe and his new partner, Deirdre "Dee Hughes. Dee was a striking woman in her 30s, with bright green eyes and fiery red hair that framed her face like a halo. Her freckled skin and lean, athletic build made her stand out as much for her looks as for her skill on the court. She wore the same team shirt as Joe, number 34, and they made a striking pair. The final match was highly anticipated. The crowd had grown, with many speculating that there might be some lingering tension between Joe and Jess, and wondering if it would show during the game. The match began without incident, though it became clear that Joe and Dee were the superior team. They moved with fluid precision, effortlessly positioning themselves to make plays. Dee's athleticism was on full display as she leapt to intercept shots, her grace and agility leaving the crowd in awe. But things started to shift during the second game. Joe seemed to target Curtis more directly, aiming his shots at his opponent's legs rather than the open court. At one point, he pulled a quick maneuver, faking a shot, and instead slamming the ball straight into Curtis's face. The crowd gasped as Curtis collapsed to the ground, blood quickly staining his shirt. Play was paused briefly while Curtis was tended to, and after that, there were no further direct attacks. The game resumed, but the outcome was inevitable. Joe and Dee crushed Jess and Curtis in straight sets, 21-4, 21-0. A humiliating defeat for the pair. After the match, the teams met at the net to shake hands. Joe extended his hand to Jess, and she glanced at it, skeptical. "What about your hand?" she asked, still bristling. "It's fine, ma'am," Joe replied, keeping his tone even. Then, loud enough for a few people to hear, he added, "Good game." But under his breath, just for her ears, he muttered, "You're a team of losers." Jess jerked her arm away violently and slapped him, but Joe was quick, dodging the hit with the same ease he'd shown on the court. She glared at him, looking around to see if anyone else had caught the exchange. The few people nearby hadn't, and the tension seemed to dissipate. At the awards ceremony later that evening, Jess was visibly irritated to learn that, for the first time, the engraved plaque on the perpetual trophy would list not just the winners, but also their opponents and the score. At the afternoon feast, Liam, a mutual friend, pulled Dee aside. "I have this nagging feeling that I've seen you somewhere before," Liam said, scratching his head. "I don't think so, Liam," Dee replied with a small smile. "But people say that to me all the time." Joe chuckled. "Dee and I were friends back in school," he explained. "We played volleyball together, but she was always way better. She made the second U.S. beach volleyball team but got injured and didn't make it to the Olympics. She was all over TV, though. She gets recognized everywhere." "Ah, that makes sense," Liam said, nodding in understanding. Later that evening, after Joe had dropped Dee off and she'd changed, she invited him to join her for a nightcap. They settled together on the couch, each holding a glass of whiskey. "I've really enjoyed spending time with you," Dee said, turning to face him. "I know we started this as a rematch, but through all the training and today's tournament, I've realized just how much I've missed being around you, Joey." She leaned in and kissed him deeply. The kiss lingered, her tongue brushing lightly across his lips as they pulled apart. When Joe opened his eyes, he saw the wet outline of her lips and the subtle tremble in her smile. His gaze drifted down the smooth curve of her jaw, past her graceful neck and to the top of her chest. The freckles across her skin seemed to dance in the soft light, adding a charming contrast to the beauty of her figure. He found himself momentarily captivated by her. He refocused on her eyes. The moisture in them made her green irises gleam, shimmering as if they held some unspoken thought. He'd been so focused on their game earlier that he'd forgotten just how striking she was. "I'd really like to explore something with you," Joe said softly, "but not now. Right now, I feel like I'm just trying to recapture something from my past. You deserve better than that. I want you to date, to get to know the real Dee, without any shadows from my past lingering over us." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That makes sense," she said, her voice warm. "I don't want to be anyone's reflection, either." They finished their drinks, shared a light kiss, and agreed to meet again in 3 weeks. Joe walked back to his apartment, his mind full, but his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. The divorce was final, and Jess and Joe had moved on. Although they lived in the same neighborhood and attended the same church, their lives had diverged. Joe was beginning to adjust to his new reality. A few days later, Ben checked in with Joe at work, asking how he was holding up and if he was ready to take action on the Matrix. "I still feel like I'm carrying the weight of 10 years of lies and a love that meant nothing to her," Joe said, bitterness in his voice. Ben nodded. "I've been thinking. We need to assess how far you're willing to go. This could get extreme." "Nuclear?" Joe asked, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "This could have big consequences," Ben said seriously. "You need to think about the long-term impact." At lunch, the team gathered in the conference room, setting up the matrix board again. Before they began, Joe added a few notes. He rewrote the physical pain category, adding a bloody nose from volleyball in red ink. He also included the social humiliation of the divorce and the embarrassment from the tournament. "Red means it's final," Joe said. "Your turn, Ben." Ben explained his updated approach, and the room fell silent. His proposal had 2 potential actions. One Joe had already discussed with Evan, and another Joe had to decide on himself. The group debated the options, but in the end, it was up to Joe to decide whether to act. Over the following weeks, Joe weighed his choices while life moved on around him. One significant event was discovering Jess was pregnant and living with Curtis in the apartment she had kept after the divorce. Though Joe hadn't been to church since the volleyball tournament, he ran into Jess outside the service one Sunday. "So, are you going to congratulate me, Joe?" she asked sarcastically. Joe raised an eyebrow. "I thought your hot body couldn't have kids, Jess. Or was Curtis's seed just too irresistible?" "Guess it must have been top class," she shot back, smirking. "It wasn't planned, though." "Loser," Joe muttered, his voice full of disdain. "How far along are you?" 7 months, Jess replied. "So you couldn't even wait until the divorce was final?" Joe scoffed. "Top class seed is top class seed," she retorted with a grin. Joe's eyes narrowed. "And you and your idiot are the real losers. You've got a trophy to prove it," he said, nodding toward the church's trophy case. Jess rolled her eyes. "You're just a loser, Joe." "A simple-minded, low-class loser, huh?" Joe shot back. A failure who will never amount to anything. And by the way, if you don't see me next week, Curtis and I are heading to Monte Carlo for a real vacation. Enjoy your life, loser. Make sure you bring an air sickness bag, he added, turning away. Bye, loser, Jess called out as she got into her car. With that, Joe walked away, knowing that life was moving on and decisions had already been made. Meanwhile, Jess's company was facing a crisis. Miriam, the CFO, and the general counsel were on edge as rumors of financial troubles spread. Layoffs were imminent, and budgets were slashed. At home, the pressure was mounting. Curtis, already distant, became even more detached as Jess's pregnancy progressed. His disinterest in doctors' visits and growing irritability were clear signs of trouble. Their move from New York had not brought the fresh start Curtis had hoped for, and their attempts to fit in with the local elite were starting to unravel. The root of the company's problems was a legal issue with the software they'd developed. The company they'd hired had unknowingly used code from another company without permission. Since Jess's company had paid for the software, they were partially responsible for the stolen code. Worse, they had sold versions of the modified software, complicating the legal fallout. Months of legal battles followed, with layoffs and escalating costs. The company that owned the original software demanded compensation, licensing fees, and fines, putting Jess's company in jeopardy. Once thriving, the business now faced a critical turning point, and Jess found herself at the center of a crisis she never expected. Jess's company was facing a tough decision: stop using a crucial software or negotiate a licensing deal for the key code. The software's creator had recently shut down, leaving Jess's team without support. Replacing it with a new program would cause major disruptions, so Jess had no choice but to sign a 10-year licensing deal, starting with a hefty upfront fee that would taper off over time. The financial burden of these fees strained the company. Salaries were cut, commissions slashed, and morale plummeted as Jess neared her due date. At home, her relationship with Curtis had deteriorated. They were no longer partners, but strangers living together. One evening, Jess returned to find most of Curtis's things gone. "What's going on, Curtis?" Jess asked, her voice shaking with panic. "I'm leaving for a job on the West Coast," Curtis replied flatly. "I have a flight." Jess's stomach dropped. "When will you be back? The baby could come any time." Curtis didn't even look up as he packed. "I'm not coming back. You have insurance, so you'll be fine." "But what about everything we talked about, raising this baby together?" she asked, confused. Curtis paused, then turned to her. "I've thought it through. I want a life of luxury. Good food, travel, no diapers. I can't do this." Jess's voice cracked. "How can you say that? I thought you loved me." Curtis sighed. "I need to go," he said flatly, walking toward the door. "Goodbye, Jess," he said, leaving without a second glance. Devastated, Jess collapsed on the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. As she cried, she suddenly felt a rush of fluid. "Oh my God," she thought, panic rising. "My water just broke." In a frantic haze, she called Gloria, a coworker. "Gloria, help! My water broke and Curtis is gone. I don't know what to do," Jess cried. "I'm at my sister's 2 hours away," Gloria said. "Call Anita or Susan." Jess's calls to Anita and Susan went unanswered. Realizing she had no time to waste, she grabbed her hospital bag and rushed to her car, her hands shaking. She started driving, but the pain of her contractions soon intensified. She couldn't continue. Then Jess remembered Joe, a neighbor who could help. She dialed his number. "Joe, help! I'm at Ashton Glen Apartments. I need you now!" she gasped. "I'm on my way," Joe replied. "What's going on?" "I can't explain, just hurry," she pleaded. A few minutes later, Joe pulled up. He rushed over to her car. "Thank you for coming," Jess said, her face pale. "Car trouble?" Joe asked, scanning the area. "No," Jess whispered. "My water broke. The baby's coming and Curtis left me." Joe looked stunned. "He left? Now?" "Yes," Jess sobbed. "He didn't want the baby this life." Joe paused, then gently said, "I can't understand you if you keep crying." Jess sniffled and tried to compose herself. "I don't know what to do." Joe's expression softened. "Is he going to New York?" "No, he quit the company. He's leaving for a job out west," Jess replied. Joe shook his head in disbelief. "That's a lot. Another contraction?" "Yes, please help," Jess gasped. Joe pulled out his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance. Stay calm." He dialed emergency, explaining the situation. "Can you get in the car with me? We'll take you to the hospital," Joe offered after hanging up. Jess, still in shock, managed a weak smile. "I don't want to ruin my new car." Joe looked at her, then at the car. "That's a nice car. And that suit, you look great, Jess." He paused before adding, "By the way, the software your company used? I wrote it. My company owns it, but I get a percentage of the profits. Those bonuses you got? I received a 7-figure payout." Jess winced from another contraction. "I see you're not in the mood for small talk," Joe said, noticing her discomfort. "The ambulance is on the way. Let's go." Jess's voice was desperate. "Joe, can you stay with me until the ambulance arrives and help me with my car?" Joe stopped, turned to her, and his expression darkened. "Curtis is an idiot, and honestly, so are you. You two deserve each other." Without waiting for a response, Joe got in his car and drove away, leaving Jess alone in her crisis. Jess delivered her baby, a healthy boy she named after her late grandfather. The days following the delivery were a blur of emotions, love for her child mixed with the profound loneliness of facing motherhood alone. Her career began to suffer as her company's financial troubles worsened, and the departure of Curtis only amplified the strain on her already precarious balance. The once perfect life she envisioned was now a distant memory, replaced by a stark reality. Meanwhile, Joe thrived in his new chapter of life. With the profits from the software he had developed, he invested in his own company, building a reputation as an innovator and a trusted leader in his field. His volleyball partnership with Dee Dee turned into a deeper friendship, and over time, the spark between them grew into something more substantial. She encouraged him to find joy beyond his past, and together they forged a future built on mutual respect and shared values. Jess and Joe's paths occasionally crossed in their small community, but their interactions were limited to polite nods and brief exchanges. Jess's attempts to rekindle a connection with Joe were met with courteous indifference. Joe had moved on, and Jess came to understand the depth of what she had lost. Years later, at a local charity event, Joe spoke about his journey. He credited his hardships for teaching him resilience and guiding him toward opportunities he might never have pursued. His words resonated with Jess, who stood quietly at the back of the room, cradling her son. For the first time, she felt a sense of closure, realizing that while she had lost Joe, she had gained lessons about herself and the importance of choices. As Joe left the stage, Dee Dee joined him, her hand slipping into his. Together, they represented a new beginning, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal and loss, life could offer second chances and unexpected joys. Jess, watching them leave, whispered to herself, "I hope you find the happiness you deserve." For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of peace, ready to face her own path forward, knowing she had the strength to rebuild her life one day at a time.